All right, so are you ready to dive into like the entire history of Israel?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Using Israel, A History by Daniel Gordis.
Sounds good to me.
It's a pretty complex and dynamic story
Okay.
with like a lot of twists and turns.
Absolutely.
And we're starting all the way back in the late 19th century
Okay.
to try to uncover this deep yearning that fueled the creation of, well, Israel.
Yeah, and it's more than just yearning, right? You've also got persecution and trying to reclaim heritage and this connection to the land that runs really deep.
Yeah, Gordis throws us right into the thick of it.
He does.
With Jewish communities in the late 19th century in Europe who are battling anti-Semitism. It was rampant back then.
It was rough.
And then he introduces us to Chaim Nachman Bielik. Have you heard of him?
I have, yeah.
He's this poet. And his work really captures that era's longing for a homeland.
Right.
Just so powerfully.
Yeah, and his poem, To the Bird, doesn't just reflect the sentiment. It captures this like really raw emotion.
Really?
If you remember those lines, he asks, in that warm and beautiful land, does evil reign and do calamities happen too?
Wow.
It really captures that desperation and that sliver of hope at the same time.
So it's like this dream of a homeland, but it's fragile, but
Right.
also very potent.
Yeah.
It's like Bielik's poetry became this language, this secret language for expressing what everyone felt but they couldn't articulate.
Absolutely.
It was during that time that Zionism started taking shape.
Right.
But it's interesting because it wasn't this united front.
Yeah, it was very much not.
Yeah, there were factions with like wildly different visions for the future.
You see, Bialik was heavily influenced by the Haskalah movement. So you've got Jewish intellectuals who are pushing for enlightenment and a place within European society. But at the same time, anti-Semitism was still alive and well, even with this integration.
So where does that leave them?
Well, that's where figures like Moses Hess come in.
Okay.
He sees this discrimination firsthand, and he's like, enough is enough. We need to return to Palestine.
Yeah, it wasn't just about escaping hardship. It was about reclaiming something that had been theirs for centuries, like their birthright.
It was this deep connection that went back centuries. And you're right, it was their birthright. You got to remember, the Jewish people's link to this land is deeply rooted. Like, it goes all the way back to biblical times through periods of exile and return. It's a story that repeats itself throughout history. This heartbreaking cycle of being forced out and then finding their way back.
So to sum all this up, this yearning for a homeland wasn't some new fad. It was woven into the very fabric of their identity, right?
Absolutely.
Amplified by the rising fear and persecution they faced in Europe.
And that yearning, while a powerful unifying force, also gave rise to some fascinating disagreements about what a Jewish homeland should actually look like.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. These weren't
Well-
just like academic debates. We're talking about the soul of a nation in the making.
So they have all these hopes and dreams, right?
Right.
But how do you build a nation?
From scratch.
From
Yeah.
scratch.
Yeah.
Gordis takes us into the early 20th century in this part.
Okay.
And, oh boy, things get interesting. It seems like everyone had their own idea about what this Jewish homeland should look like.
It's true, yeah. You've got guys like Theodor Herzl, who's like a total pragmatist,
Yeah.
right? Laser focused on just establishing a Jewish state.
Right.
He's famous for saying, we are here to lay the foundation stone of the house, which is to shelter the Jewish nation.
Wow.
So for him, it was all about political power,
Okay.
creating this safe haven through statehood.
Okay. But then you've got Had Haham coming at it from a totally different angle.
Yeah, he's worried that chasing political power might actually like hurt their spiritual core.
Whoa. So he's questioning the idea of a state.
Yeah, he's worried about losing their identity.
Oh.
And it's not just those two, right?
Okay.
You got Maps Nordau,
Okay.
who wants to build up this, and I'm not kidding, this muscular Judaism.
What does that even mean?
I know, right? He wants Jews to be strong and resilient, like break free from this whole victim narrative.
Wow. So you've got all these different approaches to this one goal.
Right. And it's incredible how all these viewpoints played out,
Yeah.
because they're not just creating a country. It's like they're defining what it means to be Jewish in a modern world.
That's a great point.
And you can't forget about A.D. Gordon.
Okay.
He's all about connecting with the land through agriculture.
Oh, okay.
He's the kibbutz movement guy.
Yeah, okay.
Pioneers work in the land trying to rebuild their connection to their roots.
It's like a giant social experiment.
Totally.
But they weren't alone there, were they?
No, not at all.
Gordis reminds us that there were already people living in Palestine.
Right.
Arabs.
And they had concerns about all these Jewish immigrants coming in.
Understandably so.
Yeah. You've got the old Yishuv, the established Jewish community,
Okay.
who are very religious,
Okay.
and they're not happy about this secular new Yishuv showing up from Europe.
So they're fighting amongst each other?
Kind of. There's definitely tension.
Yeah.
Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook tries to bridge the divide, though,
Okay.
because he knows this could get out of hand.
Yeah, that's a powder keg for sure.
Right. And on top of all that,
Yeah.
these early settlements are just trying to survive, right?
Yeah, it's the desert.
Trying to make the desert bloom,
Yeah.
reviving an ancient language, dealing with all this stuff
And under threat, I imagine.
all the time. And that whole Hebrew thing, reviving it was a mission.
Yeah.
Think about Eliezer ben Yehuda. He dedicated his life to making Hebrew an everyday language.
Wow.
And people fought him on it.
Really?
Yeah, even other Jews. Some people thought it was like sacrilegious to use Hebrew for just regular stuff.
Oh, wow. It's like Bialik using poetry to express that longing for a homeland.
It's true.
Hebrew literature in Palestine becomes this arena where they're like hashing out what it means to be a Zionist.
It's fascinating how art does that.
Yeah.
Becomes this battleground for a nation's identity. It's like you can look through a window into what they were thinking and feeling.
Right.
You've got authors like Zeev Yaveks,
Okay.
who contrasted the tourist, the diaspora Jew just visiting, with the resident who is committed to actually living there.
And that's a big distinction.
Huge. And we can't forget the Baron de Rothschild, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Bankrolling the whole thing.
Yeah. Who knows what would have happened?
Right. But one thing's for sure, early Zionism, it wasn't just one thing. It was a whole bunch of people with different ideas.
So many different visions.
Right. And those disagreements, those would go on to shape Israel's future in ways they could never have imagined.
So we've got this super complex picture.
Really complex.
You've got conflicting visions. You've got cultural clashes.
And the monumental task of creating a homeland.
Of nothing.
Yeah. And just when you think it can't get any more complicated, it does.
It's like they're walking a tightrope. Right. They're trying to build a nation, define their identity, and then boom,
Right.
World War I happens.
Exactly.
And then you've got the Balfour Declaration and the British mandate for Palestine. It's like, how much can these people take?
I know, right? And each one of those events had all these consequences that, like, nobody could predict.
Really?
Like, take the Balfour Declaration, for example.
Okay.
On the one hand, it's a win, right? They've got British support for a Jewish homeland.
Right.
But then the language is kind of vague.
How so?
Well, it doesn't really address the rights of the non-Jewish people living there.
Oh, I see.
So some people say that's where the seeds of conflict were sown.
Wow, that's a good point.
And then the British mandate is supposed to make things better, but it really just makes it more complicated.
Right, because now someone else is in charge.
Exactly. They're trying to create a homeland, but they're being controlled by someone else.
Oh, and this is where the Newly Spy ring comes in, right?
Yes. It's a crazy story, isn't it?
It's like something out of a movie.
Right. These Jewish residents are spying for the British during World War I.
Wow, that's risky.
Incredibly risky. But it just shows you how divided even the Zionists were.
In what way?
Some of them were willing to work with the British, and others didn't trust them at all.
Right, right.
But the thing is, even with all that going on, the Yishuv, the Jewish people living in Palestine,
Yeah.
they never gave up.
It's pretty inspiring.
They were draining swamps, building roads, like literally laying the foundation for a state.
Wow.
And then World War II happens,
Right.
and the Holocaust.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of it.
It really showed the world that the Jewish people needed a safe place to be.
That they couldn't rely on anyone else.
Right, exactly.
So that's what leads to the UN vote, right?
Yeah. In 1947, the UN proposes dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem as like an international zone.
It's a huge moment.
Huge. And people reacted in all kinds of ways, right?
Well,
like the Zionists saw it as a step towards their own state, which they were excited about.
Of course.
But the Arab leaders, not so much.
Right.
They saw it as a total rejection of their hopes for their own country.
And this is where things start to get really tense.
Totally. Gordis does a great job of describing how everyone felt back then, hopeful, but also scared.
Yeah, because war seemed inevitable at that point.
Exactly. And then in May of 1948, David Ben-Gurion makes it official.
He declares Israel's independence.
Yes. It's a moment that's like in all the history books, right?
Absolutely.
Years of struggle and sacrifice, and they finally had their own country.
Yeah, what a victory.
But then they had to figure out how to actually run a country.
Right, while a war is going on.
Exactly. Think about it. They're dealing with tons of immigrants, they're trying to create a national identity, and they have to defend themselves at the same time.
It's amazing they survived that time.
I know, right? But those early years really shaped what Israel is today.
In what way?
Well, they had to make tough decisions about things like territory and security.
And those questions are still so relevant today.
Exactly. Gordis's book does a great job of showing that Israel's history isn't simple.
It's complicated.
Yeah, there are no easy answers. And to really understand what's going on now, you have to understand what happened in the past.
I think that's a good place to wrap things up.
I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the early Zionist dreams to the creation of the State of Israel.
And we've seen how those early decisions are still impacting things today.
It's a fascinating story,
Totally.
full of hope and struggle and resilience.
It really makes you think
It does.
about identity and security and what it means to create a nation.
Well said.
Thank you.
To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of Israel. It's a story that continues to unfold, and we encourage you to keep learning and engaging with this complex and important part of the world.